The massive crystalline dome stretched beyond human comprehension, its walls pulsing with veins of light that carried the collective consciousness of 1,000 alien species. Ambassador David Cross stood alone in the center of the chamber, surrounded by towering forms that represented civilizations older than human recorded history. The air itself seemed alive, pressing against his lungs with the weight of accumulated power. Beings of crystal and shadow loomed above him, creatures that existed as living gas clouds drifted overhead, and entities whose very presence bent light around them filled every available space. Each represented empires spanning hundreds of worlds, and they all stared at the lone human with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. Cross had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, studying every available record of galactic politics and alien psychology. Nothing had prepared him for the sheer overwhelming presence of the Galactic Council in full assembly. The chamber itself was a work of art that transcended any human understanding of architecture, with surfaces that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the three his mind could process. The species designation human, spoke the ethereal prime, its voice like grinding stone mixed with cosmic wind. You stand before the Galactic Council to answer charges of unauthorized expansion, beyond approved territorial boundaries. Cross kept his expression neutral, despite the crushing pressure of alien attention. Around him, holographic displays materialized showing human colonies scattered across 57 worlds. What humanity considered their greatest achievement looked pitiful compared to the vast territorial holdings displayed by other council members. We followed every protocol, Cross replied, his voice carrying further than it should in the vast space. Every colony was submitted for approval. Every expansion was documented according to galactic law. A sound that might have been laughter echoed through the chamber. The Voidborn Regent, a creature of pure darkness wearing a vaguely humanoid shape, spoke with amusement dripping from every translated word. Protocols? You misunderstand your position, little primate. The protocols were never designed for your kind to succeed. The revelation hit Cross like a physical blow, but he maintained his diplomatic composure. Around him, new displays materialized showing humanity's expansion over 3 centuries, trade agreements that made no economic sense, territorial restrictions that seemed arbitrary, resource limitations that forced human colonies to struggle for basic necessities while alien worlds prospered. Your species was allocated territory sufficient for 5 worlds, perhaps 10 at most, continued another council member, its translation matrix struggling to convert concepts no human language contained. Instead, you adapted. You thrived. You began asking inconvenient questions. Cross felt his carefully maintained diplomatic facade beginning to crack. The implications were staggering. Every obstacle humanity had overcome, every seemingly bureaucratic delay that had forced them to develop new technologies or find alternative solutions, had been deliberately engineered. The containment protocols have failed catastrophically, announced a being whose form shifted between states of matter. The humans have developed fusion synthesis, quantum fold technology, and most dangerously, they have discovered the existence of the grid. A chill ran down Cross's spine. The grid was humanity's most closely guarded secret, discovered only 6 months ago when they had captured a damaged alien vessel. It was a vast network connecting all advanced civilizations, allowing instantaneous communication and coordination across the galaxy. Human scientists had believed they were the first to detect its existence. You see now the true nature of your situation, the ethereal prime said, its form shifting like smoke in a hurricane. Your kind was never intended to join the greater galactic community as equals. You were meant to serve as a buffer zone against the dangerous frontier sectors, while true civilizations prospered in the secure core systems. Cross's mind raced through the implications. Humanity had been deliberately placed in the most dangerous regions of space, facing threats that more established species avoided. The constant struggle for survival hadn't been bad luck or poor planning. It had been intentional policy. The verdict of this council is predetermined, the Voidborn Regent announced. Humanity will be relocated to appropriate territories under direct council supervision. Your current colonies will be redistributed to species capable of proper stewardship. No, Cross said quietly. The single word seemed to echo in the vast chamber with impossible resonance. The assembled aliens turned their attention fully to the human ambassador, perhaps for the first time truly focusing on him as more than a curiosity. "No," the ethereal prime repeated, its voice carrying notes of incredulous disbelief. Cross straightened, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of human struggle and achievement settling on his shoulders. "You made one critical error in your calculations. You assumed that containment would weaken us. Instead, it taught us to adapt, to innovate, and to never trust promises from those who claim to know what's best for us." The energy field that had been holding him in place flickered almost imperceptibly. Around the chamber, several alien representatives shifted nervously as they detected the anomaly. "You should have destroyed us when you had the chance," Cross continued, his voice gaining strength. "Because now it's too late for anything but consequences." The chamber's ancient system suddenly registered an impossible event. The grid itself, the network that connected all council members across the galaxy, was receiving unauthorized access from human sources. Not one intrusion, but hundreds of simultaneous connections, from locations throughout human space. Alarms that hadn't sounded in millennia began echoing through the chamber as the assembled council members realized that their most secure communication network had been compromised by the very species they had dismissed as primitive. "Impossible," gasped the ethereal prime. "No species has ever successfully penetrated grid security protocols." Cross smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. "Ambassador Cross," came a voice through the grid's communication matrix, spoken in perfect human English. "This is Admiral Blake aboard the UES Prometheus. We're here to provide diplomatic support." The council members turned to each other in what could only be described as panic. No human ship should be able to access the grid directly. No human should even know the proper communication frequencies, let alone be able to override council security measures. "Did you really think we hadn't been watching?" Cross asked, his diplomatic training finally giving way to the satisfaction of a plan 3 centuries in the making. "Every trade restriction taught us efficiency. Every territorial limitation forced us to innovate. Every bureaucratic obstacle showed us exactly how your systems worked." The chamber's lights began to flicker as something vast announced its presence just outside the council's most sacred space. Through the grid, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. Human ships were appearing in systems that should have been impossible for them to reach. Technologies that council scientists had dismissed as beyond human capability were being deployed with devastating effectiveness. "The Prometheus is requesting permission to dock," Cross announced, though he was no longer asking for permission. "I believe it's time we renegotiated humanity's position in galactic affairs." The most powerful governing body in the galaxy was about to learn that containing humanity had been their greatest mistake. The species they had tried to limit had spent 300 years learning to exceed every limitation placed upon them. And now those limitations were about to be removed permanently. The UES Prometheus materialized in space where no human vessel should have been able to exist. The Galactic Council's headquarters, a massive structure called the Nexus Core, hung before them like a dark jewel against the stars. It was a construct built by civilizations that had mastered space travel when Earth was still forming its first oceans. Admiral Rachel Blake stood on her bridge, watching her crew operate with the precise efficiency of a machine designed for war. They were humanity's finest, selected from colonies across 57 worlds, and each face reflected the same expression of cold determination that had carried their species through 3 centuries of systematic oppression. "Status report," Blake commanded, her voice cutting through the bridge's focused silence. "Grid access holding steady at 97%, reported Lieutenant Commander Torres from the navigation console. "We're detecting massive power fluctuations from the station. They're attempting to isolate our connection." Blake nodded grimly. The grid wasn't merely a communication network. It was the foundation that supported galactic civilization itself. Energy, information, raw materials, even matter itself could be transmitted through its quantum-locked pathways instantaneously across impossible distances. For 3 centuries, humanity had been systematically excluded from this network, forced to rely on primitive, faster-than-light drives and communication systems that operated at a fraction of grid efficiency, until they had captured the damaged hegemony scout ship 6 months ago. "Commander Wells," Blake said, turning to her science officer, "show me what we learned from our uninvited guests." The main display shifted to reveal a 3-dimensional map that resembled a vast neural network. Billions of interconnected nodes spread across the galaxy like synapses in some cosmic brain. As the image expanded, the true scope became visible. Every advanced civilization was connected through quantum threads that enabled instantaneous coordination across distances that should have made unified governance impossible. The grid isn't just infrastructure, Wells explained, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. It's a control mechanism. Every species that joins the galactic community becomes part of this network. They share resources, coordinate policies, make collective decisions that affect billions of lives. Except humans, Torres added from her station. We were deliberately excluded from the beginning. Blake's jaw tightened as she reviewed the intelligence files they had extracted from the captured vessel. The picture they painted was of systematic manipulation that went back to humanity's first contact with alien civilization. Trade agreements designed to keep Earth's colonies dependent on alien technology. Territory assignments that placed human settlements in the most dangerous regions of space. Scientific exchange programs that shared just enough knowledge to keep humanity advancing, but slowly enough to never become a genuine threat to established power structures. Admiral, came Ambassador Cross's voice through their newly established grid connection. The Council is demanding explanations for our network access. How should I respond? Blake allowed herself a cold smile. Tell them we learned everything from their own instruction manuals. The truth was more complex than that simple statement suggested. When the Hegemony scout vessel had crashed on Europa, its crew had followed standard emergency protocols. One of those protocols involved connecting to the grid and transmitting a distress signal to their home fleet. The aliens had assumed that no human would be capable of understanding their technology well enough to intercept and decode those transmissions. They had been catastrophically wrong. Dr. Emily Foster, humanity's leading expert in quantum mechanics and faster-than-light physics, had spent 6 months analyzing every component of that ship. What she discovered changed everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. The grid wasn't some mysterious alien technology beyond human comprehension. It was based on theoretical principles that human scientists had developed decades earlier, but never had the resources to implement. The beautiful irony, Foster had explained during their mission briefing, is that they've been using mathematical frameworks that we developed independently. The quantum field equations are nearly identical to the work Professor Kim published on Mars 20 years ago, which meant that humans could not only access the grid, they could potentially rewrite its fundamental operating parameters. Admiral, Torres announced, her voice carrying new urgency, I'm detecting massive fleet movements throughout this sector. 43 different species are mobilizing ships toward our position. Blake had anticipated this response. The moment humanity revealed their knowledge of the grid, every major power in the galaxy would react. The question was whether they would attempt negotiation or immediately resort to force. Estimated time until arrival? 14 minutes for the nearest task force. 90 minutes for the primary response fleet. Blake turned to her communications officer. Put me on all grid frequencies. Full galactic broadcast. The young lieutenant worked frantically at her console, her fingers dancing across controls that accessed communication systems humanity had been locked out of for centuries. Connection established, Admiral. Every grid-connected civilization in the galaxy is now listening. Blake took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either prevent a war or make it inevitable. This is Admiral Rachel Blake of the United Earth Systems, addressing all members of the Galactic Council and their constituent civilizations. For 3 centuries, humanity has existed on the edges of galactic society, believing ourselves to be newcomers, learning from our more advanced neighbors. Today we discovered the truth. She paused, allowing the silence to stretch across light years of space as thousands of alien minds processed her words. We were never your students. We were your prisoners. You contained us not because we were primitive, but because you recognized our potential and chose to fear it rather than embrace it. That fear was justified. Through the grid, Blake could sense the sudden spike of activity as civilizations across the galaxy reacted to her statement. Alarm, anger, fear, and something else. Something that felt almost like relief from species that had been waiting for someone to speak these words. We know about the grid. We know about the containment protocols. We know about the resource wars you've been fighting in the Outer Rim, while keeping humanity focused on internal development. Most importantly, we know about the biological research program several council species have been conducting using human subjects. That final revelation sent shockwaves through the network. It was intelligence they had pieced together from the captured ship's databanks, evidence of horrific experiments conducted on human prisoners over decades, justified as necessary research into primitive neural development patterns. "We are no longer requesting our place in galactic civilization," Blake continued, her voice carrying the authority of a species that had been pushed too far. "We are claiming it. Any attempt to prevent human expansion will be met with the full force of our resistance. We have demonstrated that your networks can be compromised. Do not force us to show you what other capabilities we have developed." She gestured to her communications officer, who terminated the broadcast with military precision. "Admiral," Wells said quietly, "was that entirely wise? We just declared our independence from the entire galactic community." Blake watched the tactical display as more ships appeared at the edge of sensor range, hundreds of vessels representing dozens of different civilizations, all converging on their position with obvious hostile intent. In her 20-year military career, she had commanded ships in dozens of engagements, but nothing approaching this scale. "No, Commander," she replied, studying the approaching fleet formations. "We didn't declare independence from the galactic community. We declared war on the system that has been oppressing it. There's a significant difference." Through the viewport, she could see the first alien vessels emerging from faster-than-light travel, massive ships bristling with weapons capable of cracking planets. Behind them, more vessels than humanity had ever assembled in one location were taking up attack formations. The galaxy had united against them, exactly as their strategists had predicted. "All hands," Blake announced over the ship's internal communication system. "Prepare for combat operations. Today we discover whether 3 centuries of human adaptability was sufficient preparation for this moment." The Prometheus began, powering up weapon systems that incorporated technology, reverse-engineered from a dozen different alien sources. Around them, space began filling with hostile vessels as the galaxy's established powers prepared to crush humanity's rebellion before it could spread. But in the depths of space, other human ships were moving into position. Ships that had been built in secret using captured alien technology. Ships that carried weapons the galaxy had never seen before. The war for human independence was about to begin, and the galaxy was going to learn why keeping humanity contained had been the greatest strategic mistake in galactic history. Ambassador David Cross felt the energy restraints around his wrists dissolve as the Galactic Council chamber erupted into chaos. Ancient beings that had ruled the galaxy for millennia struggled to comprehend what was happening as their most fundamental systems failed around them. "Impossible," the ethereal prime gasped, its gaseous form flickering with distress signals. "The grid cannot be penetrated by primitive technology." Cross straightened, flexing his fingers as circulation returned to his hands. Around him, holographic displays showed fleet movements across the galaxy. Thousands of ships were mobilizing in response to Admiral Blake's broadcast, but the scope was even more staggering than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about humanity anymore. "You still don't understand," Cross said, his diplomatic training finally giving way to 3 centuries of accumulated frustration. "We didn't penetrate your grid. We inherited it." The chamber's massive doors began opening without authorization. Through them walked a figure that shouldn't have been able to survive in the Council's specialized atmosphere. Dr. Emily Foster entered the sacred chamber, as if she belonged there, her breathing apparatus barely noticeable against the backdrop of her confident stride. "Emily," Cross nodded to her, "I was wondering when you would make your entrance." "The grid's security protocols are fascinating," Foster said conversationally, ignoring the towering alien forms that surrounded her. "But they were designed to prevent specific types of intrusion. They never accounted for someone who understood the underlying quantum architecture better than the species that found it." The Voidborn Regent's dark form writhed with what might have been rage. "You cannot comprehend technologies that predate your species by millions of years." Foster smiled with the expression of a professor about to correct a particularly stubborn student. "Actually, we can. Because you didn't invent this technology. You discovered it just like we did." The chamber fell silent except for the thrumming of machinery older than most civilizations. Foster walked to the center of the space, her footsteps echoing with impossible clarity in the vast room. "The mathematics governing the grid are based on universal quantum principles. They would be identical whether discovered by humans, by your species, or by whoever built this network originally. The real question is what happened to those original builders. Cross watched the council members exchange glances through whatever senses they used to communicate. There was fear there, ancient and deep. The predecessors vanished eons ago. The ethereal prime said finally. Their fate is unknown. No, Foster corrected gently. They evolved beyond the need for physical existence. But they left safeguards embedded in their technology, safeguards designed to prevent any species from using the grid to systematically oppress others. She gestured, and the chamber's displays came alive with information that made several council members physically recoil. Ancient code buried deep within the grid's core systems, written in mathematical principles that transcended language or culture. The containment protocols you implemented against humanity triggered those safeguards. Foster continued. For 3 centuries, the grid has been documenting every violation of its intended purpose. Every act of suppression, every manipulated trade agreement, every forced relocation of populations. All of it has been recorded and analyzed. Cross felt a deep satisfaction as he watched the galaxy's most powerful beings struggle with implications that humanity had been preparing for since they first suspected the truth. The grid was designed to connect civilizations as equals, not to enable domination. By perverting its purpose, you violated its core programming. And now, Foster added with scientific precision, it has chosen humanity as its new administrators. The statement hung in the air like a weapon waiting to detonate. Around them, the chamber's ancient systems began responding to commands issued not by the Council, but by human technicians working from ships scattered across the galaxy. This is treason against the natural order, snarled the hegemon High Command, a creature of living metal whose form towered over the humans. We will not tolerate such presumption from a primitive species. Its words were cut off as every display in the chamber shifted to show the same impossible sight. Human ships were emerging from faster-than-light travel in every major system of the galaxy, not just military vessels, but colony ships, construction platforms, and massive mobile factories that hadn't existed when Cross was captured. While you were busy containing us, Cross said, we were busy preparing. Every restriction you placed on our expansion taught us to be more efficient. Every obstacle you put in our path forced us to innovate. You educated us in the art of exceeding limitations. The scale of humanity's preparation was becoming clear through the grid's displays. Human forces were establishing positions in systems that the Council had considered completely secure. Supply networks that had taken other species centuries to build were being replicated in days using grid access and human engineering efficiency. The mathematical elegance of it, Foster continued, addressing the Council as if they were her research subjects, is that you provided us with complete intelligence on your own capabilities. Every containment protocol required detailed analysis of human potential. Every resource restriction needed precise knowledge of our supply chains. You studied us so thoroughly that you handed us the keys to your own weaknesses. Cross watched the ethereal prime's form begin to collapse inward, a sign of absolute defeat among its species. The combined war fleets massing against your forces will annihilate any hope of human survival. Will they? Cross asked, stepping closer to the being that had condemned humanity to centuries of artificial limitation. Your fleets are impressive, certainly, but they're designed to fight other civilizations that respect galactic conventions, species that honor territorial boundaries and diplomatic protocols, civilizations that conduct warfare according to established rules. He paused, allowing the implications to settle. We're humans. We don't follow your rules. We never have. Through the grid, tactical reports began flowing in from across the galaxy. Human forces weren't engaging the alien fleets in traditional combat. Instead, they were systematically targeting infrastructure, communication relays, supply depots, the massive logistics networks that kept interstellar civilizations functioning across impossible distances. Your war machines are formidable, Foster observed with clinical detachment, but they require constant resupply, maintenance, and coordination to function effectively. We're not attempting to destroy your fleets directly. We're cutting the infrastructure that makes them possible. The displays showed the results in real time. Alien task forces grinding to a halt as their supply lines simply vanished. Communication breakdowns as human grid access allowed them to intercept and redirect vital military communications. confusion spreading through command structures that had never faced an enemy capable of systematic warfare on this scale. Cross felt the satisfaction of a plan centuries in the making finally reaching fruition. You wanted to contain humanity until we could be safely managed. Congratulations, you succeeded. You contained us just long enough for us to study your methods, understand your weaknesses, and prepare for this exact moment. The Void-born Regent's form solidified into something approaching physical matter, a sign of extreme agitation among its kind. Even if your tactics prove successful, you cannot hold the galaxy. Our combined populations number in the trillions. Your entire species comprises less than 30 billion individuals. Foster's smile became genuinely warm. You're thinking about this problem incorrectly. We're not trying to conquer the galaxy. We're trying to liberate it. She gestured toward the displays again, which now showed something that surprised even Cross. On dozens of worlds throughout Council territory, populations were rising against their own governments. Species that had been suppressed by Council member civilizations were using the chaos of the current crisis to break free from their own chains. You see, Foster explained patiently, the grid doesn't just record violations against humanity. It documents violations against everyone. And now that we control significant portions of the network, that information is becoming public knowledge throughout the galaxy. Cross realized the true scope of what Foster and her team had accomplished. They hadn't just gained access to the grid. They had turned it into the most powerful intelligence weapon in galactic history. How many species, Cross asked quietly, were being systematically suppressed, according to grid records spanning the last 50,000 years? Approximately 70% of all member civilizations were operating under some form of Council-imposed limitation. Resource quotas, territorial restrictions, technological embargoes, population controls. The Council maintained power by ensuring that no individual species could challenge their collective authority. The chamber filled with sounds Cross had never heard before as dozens of different species discovered that their carefully maintained order was collapsing around them. Emergency communications flooded the grid as governments across the galaxy struggled to maintain control over populations that were learning the truth about their situation. You have condemned the galaxy to chaos, the ethereal prime whispered, its voice barely audible. Without central coordinate, 8 months after the grid liberation, the galaxy had transformed into a battlefield unlike anything in recorded history. Captain Maria Santos stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, watching the burning remains of what had once been the Dominion's most important manufacturing world. The tactical display painted the story in stark numbers. 23 different wars now raged across the galaxy, as species that had been suppressed for millennia fought to claim their independence from former overlords. The careful balance that had maintained galactic peace for thousands of years had shattered in a matter of weeks. Captain, Commander Thompson reported from his station, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a crew that had been in combat operations for 6 straight months. We're receiving distress calls from the Alterian system. Republic forces are moving to reclaim their former mining colonies. Santos nodded, studying the strategic display that showed the galaxy's new reality. Where once there had been stable territories controlled by Council member species, now there were contested zones, massive refugee populations, and resource wars that grew more savage with each passing day. Any communication from Admiral Blake? The Admiral's task force is still engaged with Council remnant forces in the core systems. They've successfully secured the primary grid nodes, but enemy forces are contesting every relay station and communication hub. Santos felt the weight of command settling heavily on her shoulders. When they had launched the grid liberation, humanity's leadership had known it would destabilize galactic civilization. They had not anticipated how completely that collapse would unfold. Lieutenant, Santos called to her communications officer, incoming priority transmission from Earth Command. Santos straightened in her command chair. Direct communication with Earth was increasingly difficult, as the grid network came under constant attack from Council loyalist forces attempting to regain control of the system that had once given them absolute power over galactic affairs. Put it through. The image that materialized on her main screen was General Patricia Stone, the woman who had coordinated the original liberation strategy. She looked older than Santos remembered, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. Captain Santos, the general said without preamble. What's your current assessment of the galactic situation? Santos glanced at her senior staff before responding. They all wore the same expression of grim determination, mixed with growing concern about the consequences of their actions. Complete systemic collapse, General. We achieved our primary objective of breaking Council dominance, but the secondary effects are beyond our worst-case projections. Current intelligence suggests total civilizational breakdown within 18 months unless the situation stabilizes. Stone's expression remained carefully neutral. Are you recommending we attempt to restore the previous order? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Santos knew that several members of her crew had been asking similar questions privately. The suffering caused by the galactic wars was immense, and humanity bore direct responsibility for triggering the chaos. No, ma'am, Santos said after a moment's consideration. We can't restore what we've broken, but we need to start planning for what comes next. Agreed. Which brings me to the reason for this communication. We've received contact from an unexpected source. The image shifted to show a recording that made Santos's blood run cold. It was a message from something called the Predecessor Archive, a legendary database that most galactic civilizations considered a myth from the distant past. The figure in the recording was clearly artificial, but designed to communicate with biological species. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that suggested vast intelligence operating beyond normal comprehension. To the species that has chosen to restore the grid to its original purpose, the construct said, we extend our guidance. The path you have taken leads through necessary chaos toward ultimate liberation. We have observed. We have waited. We are prepared to provide assistance. Santos stared at the recording in amazement. General, are you saying the predecessors still exist? Not in any form we would recognize as life, Stone confirmed. But they've been monitoring galactic development, waiting for a species to emerge that could break the cycle of systematic oppression the Council created. The implications were staggering. If the predecessors still existed and were willing to share their knowledge with humanity, it could change the fundamental nature of the conflict. There's additional intelligence, the general continued. Our analysis teams have been studying captured Council archives. We've discovered that the containment protocols used against us weren't the first. The Council has been systematically preventing species advancement for over 80,000 years. Every time a civilization showed signs of rapid development, they were either contained through artificial limitations or eliminated entirely. Santos felt sick. How many species, General? Conservative estimates suggest several hundred advanced civilizations were destroyed or artificially limited. The galaxy should be home to thousands of spacefaring species. Instead, we have a few dozen council members ruling over billions of deliberately suppressed populations. The bridge fell silent as her crew absorbed this information. The wars currently raging weren't just about territory or resources. They represented species fighting for the fundamental right to exist, without artificial constraints on their development. General, Thompson interjected, what are our current orders regarding both the ongoing conflicts and this predecessor contact? Stone leaned forward slightly. You're to proceed immediately to coordinates I'm transmitting now. A team of our best scientists and diplomats is already en route to that location. Your mission is to establish contact with the predecessors and determine what kind of assistance they're offering. Santos checked the coordinates as they appeared on her navigation display. They pointed to a region of space that official charts listed as completely empty. No stars, no planets, no resources worth claiming or defending. And the galactic wars? She asked. We continue supporting liberation movements while preparing for something much larger in scope. If the predecessors are willing to share their technology and knowledge, we need to be ready to use it to rebuild galactic civilization according to different principles. The transmission ended, leaving Santos alone with her thoughts and a crew that looked as overwhelmed as she felt. 8 months ago, they had been fighting for humanity's right to exist as equals in galactic civilization. Now they were potentially being recruited to rebuild that civilization from its foundations. Captain, her communications officer announced, we're receiving multiple emergency signals from the inner systems. Council forces are retaking lost territory through extreme measures. Santos accessed the intelligence reports and immediately wished she hadn't. The images showed orbital bombardments of civilian populations, biological weapons deployed against rebel worlds, entire star systems being stripped of resources to fuel the Council's increasingly desperate war machine. The galaxy's former rulers were not accepting their loss of power gracefully. Faced with the collapse of their authority, they had chosen to destroy everything rather than allow other species to claim freedom. "Commander Thompson," Santos said quietly, "prepare the ship for immediate departure to the predecessor coordinates. Whatever they're offering, we need it before the Council destroys half the galaxy to maintain their control." As the Vengeance engaged its grid-enhanced faster-than-light drive, Santos watched the tactical display showing chaos spreading across countless star systems. Billions of beings were dying in wars that humanity had triggered by demanding their independence. The question now was whether they could find a way to end those wars before galactic civilization collapsed entirely under the weight of accumulated violence and hatred. In the depths of space, ancient systems that had remained dormant for millennia began activating in response to signals they had been waiting eons to receive. The predecessors had watched the galaxy struggle under artificial limitations for far too long, and it was time to finish what they had started when they first built. The grid as a tool of liberation rather than oppression, the galaxy burned with the fires of revolution, but from those flames, something entirely new was about to emerge. Whether that emergence would save or damn galactic civilization remained to be determined. But for the first time in 80,000 years, every species in the galaxy had the opportunity to discover their true potential without artificial constraints. The age of systematic oppression was ending. What would replace it would depend on choices yet to be made by species finally free to choose their own destinies. The coordinates led to what appeared to be empty space between star systems. But as the UES Vengeance dropped out of faster-than-light travel, Captain Maria Santos found herself staring at something that challenged her understanding of reality itself. It was a structure the size of a small moon, but clearly artificial. Its surface seemed to shift between solid matter and pure energy, creating patterns that were difficult to look at directly. The ship's sensors reported readings that made no logical sense. Mass fluctuations, gravitational anomalies, and energy signatures that suggested technology far beyond anything known to galactic civilization. "Captain," Lieutenant Rodriguez said from her communication station, her voice filled with awe, "I'm detecting 19,000 individual ships inside that structure. They're reading as human vessels, but the signatures don't match any designs in our databases." Santos turned to stare at her officer. "That's impossible. Humanity doesn't possess 19,000 ships in our entire combined fleet." "Ma'am," Rodriguez continued, her fingers working frantically across her console, "I'm also detecting active construction. They're building additional ships inside that structure at a rate our computers cannot calculate." Before Santos could respond, a presence filled the bridge. Not a voice through their communication systems, but something that seemed to speak directly to their minds with concepts that transcended normal language. "Welcome, Captain Santos. I am the coordinator, speaking for those your species calls the predecessors. Your kind has been selected to receive the inheritance we prepared for this moment in galactic history." The main screen shifted to display the interior of the vast structure. What Santos saw explained why her sensors couldn't calculate the construction rate. Automated systems beyond human imagination were assembling ships using techniques that seemed to weave matter from pure energy. The vessels being created were recognizably human in basic design, but enhanced with technology that made them appear more like the dreams of engineers than practical machines. "Admiral Blake and Ambassador Cross have already arrived," the coordinator continued, "along with Dr. Foster and representatives from 27 liberated species. The transformation process is beginning." Santos felt her ship moving without any command from her crew. The Vengeance was being guided into the structure by forces that operated beyond her understanding of physics. "Captain," Commander Thompson said quietly, "are we still in control of our vessel?" "Unknown," Santos replied, watching as her ship passed through what appeared to be a solid barrier without any resistance. "But I don't believe we're in immediate danger." The interior of the predecessor facility defied everything Santos thought she knew about space and engineering. Vast chambers extended in directions that seemed to fold back on themselves. Gravity operated according to local convenience rather than universal law. Everywhere she looked, humans were working alongside beings she had never encountered before. Species that moved like organized light, creatures that existed as geometric patterns, entities that seemed to be composed of pure thought given temporary form. The Vengeance settled into a docking bay that reformed itself around the ship, like living metal responding to conscious direction. As Santos and her senior staff prepared to leave their vessel, the Coordinator's presence returned. The Galactic Wars will end within 48 hours, it announced with absolute certainty. Not because the combatants choose peace, but because they will lack the capability to continue fighting. Santos paused at the airlock. What do you mean by that? The grid network is about to undergo its final evolutionary phase. Instead of merely connecting civilizations, it will begin redistributing resources according to need rather than accumulated power. Species that have hoarded wealth while others suffered will find their excess flowing to those who require it most. The implications were staggering. The Coordinator wasn't just talking about ending the current wars. It was describing the complete reorganization of galactic economics and politics. As Santos stepped off her ship, she found herself in a vast chamber where Admiral Blake was engaged in intense discussion with Dr. Foster and several beings she couldn't identify. Blake looked older than when Santos had last seen her, but there was something in her expression that suggested she had found answers to questions that had been troubling humanity for generations. "Maria," Blake called, approaching to greet her. "You're arriving at exactly the right moment for a briefing that will change everything. We thought we knew about the galaxy." Blake led her to a central area where a three-dimensional display showed the current state of galactic civilization. War zones pulsed red across hundreds of star systems. Refugee populations moved like scattered points of light, and the territorial boundaries that had defined interstellar politics for millennia were dissolving in real time. The predecessors didn't disappear, Blake explained. They evolved beyond the need for physical existence, but they left behind systems designed to guide galactic development. The grid was never intended to be a tool of control. It was meant to be a support system for emerging civilizations. Dr. Foster joined them, her face glowing with scientific excitement that reminded Santos why humanity had survived 3 centuries of systematic oppression. "Maria, you need to understand what they've shown us. The technology we've been fighting over is just the most basic layer. The true grid extends into dimensions we didn't even know existed." The display shifted to show something that made Santos's mind struggle to process the information. The familiar galaxy was visible, but it was connected to other galaxies through pathways that twisted through space-time itself. In each of those distant star clusters, she could see the energy signatures of civilizations that had achieved the same evolutionary breakthrough humanity was experiencing. "How many?" Santos asked, her voice barely a whisper. 51 galaxies in our local cluster," Foster replied with wonder, each one home to species that broke free from their version of centralized control systems. "The predecessors have been waiting for us to join that community for 80,000 years. The Coordinator's presence filled the chamber again. "The transformation will require significant adjustments. Species that cannot adapt to cooperative paradigms will be relocated to regions where they can develop, according to their own preferences. Those that actively resist the changes will find themselves unable to access the resources necessary for interstellar civilization." Santos understood the implications. The Council members and their allies would be effectively isolated until they could accept a universe where power was shared, rather than hoarded by a select few. "What about humanity?" she asked. "What's our role in this new structure?" Blake smiled with the first genuine happiness Santos had seen from her in months. "We're being offered a choice. We can return to our own territory and develop as we would have without galactic interference, or we can accept the responsibility of helping to guide the transformation process." "Guide it how exactly?" "By doing what we've always done best," Foster interjected with enthusiasm. "By adapting, improvising, and refusing to accept that things have to remain the way they've always been. The other species in galactic civilization have been conditioned to follow established patterns for millennia. We haven't." Santos looked around the chamber at the impossible architecture and the beings that seemed to exist beyond normal physical constraints. 8 months ago, she had been fighting desperately for humanity's survival. Now she was being offered a role in reshaping the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. "There's something else you need to see," Blake added, leading her to another display. "The wars that are raging now aren't going to end with winners and losers. They're going to end with every species having access to the resources they need to reach their full potential." Through the facility's displays, Santos could see the changes beginning across the galaxy. Ships throughout space were finding their weapon systems becoming non-functional. Resource convoys were being redirected by grid overrides that no government could countermand. On thousands of worlds, populations that had been fighting for basic survival were discovering that supply ships were arriving from sources they had never contacted. The council members who created the containment protocols will be given the same choice as everyone else, the coordinator announced. They can accept the new paradigm and find their place in a cooperative galactic community, or they can be relocated to isolated regions where they can develop their own societies without affecting others. Santos felt a deep satisfaction as she realized what was happening. Humanity hadn't just won their war for independence. They had accidentally triggered the transformation that the predecessors had been preparing for millions of years. "Captain," Thompson said, approaching with a data transmission device in his hands, "I'm receiving reports from across the galaxy. The fighting is stopping everywhere, not because of ceasefires or negotiations, but because the warships simply can't function anymore." Santos nodded, watching the displays as red zones of conflict began fading to indicators of stability. It would take time for the full transformation to complete. But the galaxy's long age of systematic oppression was finally ending. "Admiral," she said to Blake, "I assume we're accepting the predecessor's offer to help Gaiditier."